Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the IISS. We have North Korea on the menu this morning as the main dish. On the breakfast menu, we have Mark Fitzpatrick here to the left. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation. He has been in this field for something like 33 years, 26 of which were for the U.S. government, working for the most part on this issue, and not just in Washington, but also in Vienna and in Tokyo. As the Russians say, he knows where the dog is buried. He's written extensively on non-proliferation issues for IISS, not just relating to Northeast Asia, but also South Asia and Iran. So he has a comparative perspective to bring to this issue should you all in the audience want to pursue those lines of questioning. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now. He'll speak for whoever he wishes to speak, and then we'll have Q&A for the duration of the session. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Steve. In case anybody has to leave early, the answer to the question, is regime change, the answer is yes. In the long run, let's hope it's the medium run.
Okay, we can break for coffee.
But it's not obviously an immediate answer to the current situation. North Korea's actions and statements the last few weeks, however, reinforce the conclusion that there's only one happy ending to this long-running tragedy: unification of the Korean Peninsula as a democratic, free enterprise-based republic. My premise, shared now by most analysts in Washington, I believe, is that North Korea will not trade away its nuclear arsenal for any amount of economic or political benefits. Pyongyang sees its strategic weapons as essential to the preservation of the regime, and not just because they see themselves as under siege by powerful hostile forces. Big bang weapons are the only product of which the regime can boast. In every other field of human endeavor and achievement, the North Koreans lag far behind their southern relatives, be it in areas of economy, science, culture, or political development. Nuclear weapons filled the regime's sense of power and pride. North Korea insists that it will not give them up as long as the United States has nuclear weapons within range. And I think we have every reason to believe them. Now, some of my friends will insist that we don't know that until we test the theory through negotiation. But we're not without data points. Glenn Davies tested the theory last year, and the negotiation strategy did in fact work for 3 weeks. The 2007 agreement under the six-party talks and the 2005 joint statement in September that year also heralded short-term successes. Not least of all, the partial dismantlement of key aspects of the plutonium program, including the cooling system for the 5-megawatt reactor. The 1994 agreement, the agreed framework, achieved more and for a longer period. It stopped plutonium production for over 8 years. Not to belittle that 1994 agreed framework in any way, but there's a pattern here. North Korea was in each case willing to trade away some parts of the nuclear program, but never to give it up entirely. And each time they suspended plutonium production, they pursued the uranium enrichment path to nuclear weapons. Now, one might argue that the United States didn't try hard enough, not at a high enough level, not with a big enough of an offer. Maybe. By this line of reasoning, however, the test of intent can never be proven, because fault of insufficiency can always be found with the gift and the giver. The offer will never be enough. Those who say that the leader of the free world should call Kim Jong-un or send his Secretary of State to Pyongyang to begin talks on a peace treaty without South Korea can't be serious. No U.S. president can give in to blackmail so cravenly. So another way to assess North Korea's nuclear intentions is to examine the history of the nuclear program. From the beginning of the effort, it now seems clear that nuclear weapons were North Korea's intent. Jonathan Pollock's Adelphi book, No Exit, shows that conclusively. Drawing on former Soviet archives and Chinese sources, he illustrated North Korea's interest in nuclear weapons dating to the early 1960s. The 5-megawatt reactor that North Korea began to build around 1980 was designed primarily for plutonium production and only ostensibly for electricity. The same with the 50-megawatt reactor. When North Korea acceded to the NPT in 1985, it did so under duress from the Soviets and with a clear intention of violating it. The delays and omissions in North Korea's declaration of nuclear holdings as required by the NPT should have made that clear. Even if North Korea were to agree to give up its nuclear weapons and dismantle the facilities, which I don't believe for a moment it will ever do voluntarily, there would be enormous problems of verification, given the ease of hiding uranium enrichment facilities and North Korea's record of concealment. I don't contend that engagement and negotiation are meaningless strategies. As noted, North Korea has been willing to barter away some aspects of the program, and it might be willing to do so again, and some is better than nothing. The freeze on plutonium production in 1994 was far better than the alternative, even though North Korea violated the agreement by pursuing enrichment. So yes, the door to engagement should remain open. At a later date, the United States should be willing to talk, and at senior levels, but not now, not in response to threats. Thinking back to 2006, when 2 months after North Korea tested the first nuclear weapon, the United States agreed to bilateral talks. It might have seemed right at the time, but I think it created a lesson that we should reinforce. While pressing for complete and verifiable dismantlement of the nuclear weapons program, we should not expect that diplomacy will by itself produce a nuclear weapons-free North Korea. This is because Washington cannot give Pyongyang what it wants. The United States cannot offer a substitute to what Kim and his cohorts think the nuclear weapons provide, a guarantee of regime survival and a path to dominance of the peninsula. The sad irony is that strategic weapons program undermines regime survival because it hampers prospects for economic development. The trade, aid, and investment from South Korea, Japan, and the West that could help North Korea escape its poverty trap will not be forthcoming as long as North Korea wields the nuclear threat. And now North Korea is shooting itself in the foot again by closing down the Kaesong Joint Enterprise Zone that provides one of the few legitimate avenues for hard currency earnings. Once upon a time, Kaesong was seen as a model for employing maybe up to a fifth of the North Korean working population. Now, even though Kaesong is likely to reopen, it will not attract any additional South Korean businesses because who would face the risk? Meanwhile, the new leader faces serious vulnerabilities. The daily threats emanating from Pyongyang may be evidence not of power, but of a crisis of leadership. Positing an external enemy intent on attack is a tactic that autocrats throughout history have relied upon to maintain internal cohesion. Creating an artificial crisis with the United States is Kim's way of demonstrating power so that he can later boast of having stood up to the evil Americans and force them to stand down from their invasion intentions. Now, I recognize that Kim Jong-un survived his first year of power far better than many, including myself, had predicted. But he still remains on shaky grounds. One wonders if the purges of senior military leaders this past year and the shift of control over foreign revenue earnings from the military to the party have created dissension. Last summer's stated plans for economic reforms show no sign of implementation. Meanwhile, the government cannot control the creeping black market economy. The huge disconnect between the ostensible rules and the reality of economic interchange has contributed to a culture of corruption. Perhaps most importantly, the regime cannot control the flow of information inside North Korea. With DVDs and memory sticks, with South Korean soap operas and K-pop stars flooding the country, ordinary North Koreans can see the depth of their own impoverishment. This is one case in which the South Korean government may not care so much about pirated DVDs that they're going to be flooding North Korea. The wealth across the long border with China provides another basis for unfavorable comparison. Adding to the information flow are the now tens of thousands of North Koreans who are working abroad. They can't help but become contaminated with some foreign ideas. As former ROK National Security Advisor Chun Young-woo contended at a presentation at IISS in London last month, these vulnerabilities should be exploited to give North Korean leaders reason to understand that there's a choice between regime survival and nuclear weapons. And if the lesson does not hold, and it probably won't, policies by the United States and its allies and partners that sharpen Pyongyang's binary choice will also hasten the day of Korean unification. At a session at CSIS last month, it was argued that the United States should move from a stance of strategic patience to policies that encourage change in non-kinetic ways. Now, the North Koreans spout nonsense when they talk about unprovoked attacks from the outside. But they do have something to really worry about, a threat from the inside. So increasing the information flow to the people of North Korea is a cost-effective approach. And it doesn't have to be carried out in ways that publicly confront the regime. Brochure balloons don't have to be launched in the middle of the day with a lot of publicity. It can be done at night. Powerful radio signals can be beamed into North Korea using domestic frequencies so that people can actually get it on their radios. Overseas North Korean workers can be targeted for political proselytizing. Secondly, complaints about North Korea's appalling human rights record should not again be stifled in deference to dialogue over strategic issues. Thanks by a push by Japan and the European Union and a growing global disgust, the UN Human Rights Council finally agreed last month to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate these violations. A year from now, the report the commission presents may well hold the DPRK leadership guilty of crimes against humanity. As UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, said in January, North Korea's deplorable human rights situation has no parallel anywhere in the world. I recently was asked by BBC if North Korea was the worst government in the world, and I didn't want to, I sort of hedged and I said, well, maybe Zimbabwe, but then I investigated a little bit and I realized, no, North Korea is the worst. So such statements and findings should be highlighted in the information packets that are showered on North Korea, to let both the victims and their oppressors know that the world is watching. It's the right thing to do, both morally and strategically. Thirdly, economic sanctions should be applied that target the survivability of the regime. It was inevitable but regrettable that China continues to limit the impact of Security Council resolutions. In the last one, the United States wanted to include tighter measures affecting North Korean shipping and financial activity. A mandate to inspect all North Korean shipping for possible contraband would not have been out of order, since so much of North Korea's foreign trade is in black or gray areas, with so much use of false labeling and misdeclaration. Under the terms of Resolution 2094 last month, interdictions are mandated if member states have reasonable grounds to believe that vessels or vehicles are transporting materials that, quote, could contribute to North Korea's banned nuclear or missile programs. The ambiguity of that phrase, could contribute, provides a lot of latitude for inaction. But it also provides a legal basis for states that want to take action to stop nearly any North Korean ship for inspection, on grounds that North Korea's record of misinformation casts doubt on all of its cargo declarations. China also protected North Korea's accounts in Chinese banks from being targeted for freezing by the Security Council resolution. Going after those accounts would deny Kim Jong-un access to the slush funds that help him keep the loyalty of the elite. The freezing of North Korea's accounts in Bank of Delta Asia in 2005 got the attention of the regime like few other measures before or since. And I think it was badly timed then, coming so soon after the joint declaration, and it effectively gutted that diplomatic achievement. But apart from the bad timing, it was a well thought out operation. And now that Kim Jong-un has thrown down the gauntlet, I think it's time to take this playbook down from the shelf. The use of secondary sanctions that have been employed against Iran should also be applied to North Korea. Obviously, North Korea relies less on international trade than does Iran. It has no oil to cut off. But it's a far worse actor than Iran and should not be treated any more leniently. More sanctions attention could also be focused on the commercial actors outside North Korea who knowingly or inadvertently abet black market activity at various stages of the supply chain. As recommended by researchers at SIPRI in Stockholm, this means individuals who registered or manage the ships and aircraft involved in the trade, those who serve as directors, staff, or sponsors of front companies, and those involved in financial arrangements. In addition to targeting those individuals for penalties, a way should be found to offer rewards for cooperation in thwarting black market transactions and exposing the key players, a whistleblower program. Such sanctions are not an end in themselves, of course. They are means to put pressure on the regime to either roll back its nuclear threat or face growing strains on its areas of vulnerability. Such pressure may hasten the day when we no longer have to worry about North Korea, because there won't be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but rather one unified Korea. So the goal is not regime change per se. Replacement of warlords would not necessarily be any better than the Kim family. The better solution, rather, is unification in a manner that entails the end of the regime. Now, we're all aware of the recent checkered history of regime change policies, and particularly how it went disastrously wrong in the case of Iraq. To be successful, regime change cannot be forced from the outside, not through military intervention. It has to come about indigenously. But external players can help to create conditions that can help foster a change. And the countries that create those conditions, with a set-upon population in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, will win their gratitude for generations. Just as the United States correctly called for the reunification of Germany, so too should we advocate for the reunification of Korea. Thank you.
A stirring vision. I think we should go straight to Q&A. I bet that there are a lot of reactions to this provocative thesis. We start here, but I want to establish a couple of things. First, is this on the record?
Yeah, I don't speak for any government, so and I'm never going to get a visa to go to North Korea anyway. So let's go for it.
So kind of a low opportunity cost. Okay, so we're on the record, and please say who you are and where you come from before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. I just write whatever Mark tells me, so life is much simpler. It's much simpler for me. Thanks.
Chris Nelson. You have to ask the China question, and I've taken it in my report going, the China chimera, but it just doesn't seem possible that we can come up with some clever idea that's going to pursue the kind of things that you're talking about here, very excellent summary of all the issues, without more from them. Is that delusional? Have you seen, I just saw last night when I got back from New Mexico, the People's Daily editorial. That's serious, apparently, in People's Daily, maybe not so much in Global Times. What should we be saying to China now that we haven't said before, or is that not the way to look at it? Should we just keep saying what we've been saying and sooner or later trust that their definition of self-interest will come closer to ours? Thanks.
Chris, I didn't mention China much because it's just so obvious.
He needs a visa.
Yeah. Me too.
So obvious that China is a key player, but I think we tend to overplay the China role here. So I tried to think of things that the United States and its allies could do by means of information flow and sanctions that don't have to be Security Council measures and other forms of pressure. And I think the Chinese, they get it, and we see more and more signs of them being fed up with the North Koreans, but they're not probably ever going to be fed up enough to pull the plug on North Korea. We can't expect that that's going to be the solution. So we have to look for, I think, conditions that other states can do with or without China.
The microphone is on its way.
I'm Harlan Ullman. Thanks, Mark. A couple of questions. First, relating to your nuclear weapons. What makes you think they actually have a deployable weapon as opposed to a device? The intelligence community is very divided, and there's some question as to when they actually could have an operational weapon. I'm not talking about just something missile-launched, but something that's already deployable. And second, as you know, during the early years of the Cold War, we thought that Beijing and Moscow and the Politburos were a pill. And now we say the same thing about Pyongyang. Who do you think, in your estimation, really has the best view of what's happening inside North Korea, if anyone? Is Kim really in charge as the young Sun Kings and his father, his uncle-in-law, and brother's family? Who do you put great confidence in knowing what's really happening there? And how do you respond to the notion that the Kim family has been in power for so long that, rather like Japan under the emperor, there is almost an undying loyalty by a large segment of the population, which means that attempts, as we used during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, for information and so forth to flow in really is not likely to work in Korea.
Good questions all. I just was trying to check back and see how I phrased, because one reason I wrote this all out was to try to be careful in how I phrased, so I didn't accord a nuclear weapons status. That I don't know if they have nuclear weapons or not. I talk about a nuclear arsenal. They obviously have devices. Those devices probably can be fashioned into a weapon, but we don't know for sure. Maybe they can be put on the tip of a ballistic missile. We don't know for sure. They've been working on it for a long time, though, so even if they can't do it now, they soon can. So I think whether or not they have a deployable nuclear weapon today, we have to just make the worst case analysis and assume that they do, and that assumption probably has at least a 50-50 chance of being right today. Who knows whether Kim Jong-un is really in charge, or let's say the extent to which he is in charge, the extent to which this is a one actor being able to make decisions. I tend to think that there's a coterie of senior party leaders and generals and relatives involved in this consensus decision making, but who knows? I think the Russians and the Chinese must have the best views on this. They have large embassies. They've been dealing with the North Koreans for a long time, and experts like Andrei Lavkov, one of the best analysts about North Korea. But I despair a little bit about the Chinese knowledge about what's going on. I had an argument with a Chinese general earlier this week at the Carnegie conference in the coffee sessions, and the general was arguing that that there's no black market economy in North Korea, and that the state distribution system provides all of the food for the system, and that it's impossible for North Koreans to get outside information. And I just think 20 years out of date. So who knows? Undying loyalty by the population, yeah, that's a real problem. The indoctrination has been going on for so long. I think you could call it brainwashing. Doesn't even wash off when North Korean economic defectors show up in Seoul. They still talk about Kim Jong-il as being a great leader. I don't think they talk about Kim Jong-un that way. Now, most of them got out before he got there. But typically in dynasties over the years, by the time you get to the third king, the vulnerabilities become more exposed, especially with somebody so contested. So maybe it will not, I think it's a hard nut to crack, but I think trying the information flow route is worth it.
Can I ask a clarification, just a quick clarification question?
Sure.
Actually, I'm sorry. Do you think the board marshal actually believes this stuff? Has he bought in that he's really, sorry, does the lad really believe this, or is he in on the joke? If he's in on the joke, then maybe we can talk to him. If he really thinks that we were invading and that he's really held us up, that would be a whole different kind of thing, wouldn't it? A whole future.
One hopes that he is in on the pretense, but I just find it hard to conclude on that. You know, last year when he struck the deal with the United States, and the big question was not why did he break the deal, but why did he strike the deal knowing that he was going to break it? And so that's either evidence of self-delusion or somebody who is just doing what others advised him to do, or just proceeding along paths without thinking too much about it.
Sir.
Hi, Mike Massetti. We now know that some of the worst intelligence on East Germany before 1989 was held by the West Germans. They had a very vastly inflated idea of how well East Germany was doing, especially economically. How well informed do you think the Republic of Korea is about the situation in the North? And to what degree is that government going to be willing to participate in the kind of activities that you're talking about to destabilize the North? And what is basically their view about destabilizing the North and whether they're ready to take those risks?
I think South Korea relies too much on defector reports that are out of date, and their information flow might not be perfect, but they obviously have far greater insights than we do. I didn't use the word destabilize the regime, but I guess if that's the conclusion you draw, I want to create conditions for destabilization. I think the previous government probably was thinking about these ways, and I presume that the current government, being of the same party, might be of a similar ilk, but I don't have insights into their thinking.
All the way in the back, Hans?
Hans Grindike from CITES. Great presentation. But I'd like to ask you to think a bit more about the nature of the regime change that most of us would like to see happen. How would that regime change unfold if it comes internally? Would it be sort of people power, folks going into the streets? It's hard to imagine that society. Would it be a split within the military coup, divisions between the party and the military? Would it be a palace sort of coup? How would you envision that unfolding? And then the second part of the question is, if we are in the midst of that kind of a regime change, what is the to-do list for the United States? Do we sit and watch it happen? Do we intervene? How do we? I had tried on several occasions in and out of government to talk to the Chinese about scenarios like this. They don't talk about it because they think if they talk to us about it, it implies it's going to happen. So what should the United States be doing in the midst of that regime change? Nuclear weapons issues, humanitarian issues, refugee issues, possible military action that points out. So those are my two questions.
Those are the most difficult questions. In our dossier on North Korean security challenges published 2 years ago, we reviewed some of the ways in which regime change can come about. You know, there's hard landing, soft landing, variations in between, and so forth. I don't think anybody ever gets this right. Who would have predicted the way the South Korean government changed with an internal loyal advisor to President Chun finishing him off and putting in place the regime, the changes to the democratic system in South Korea. So maybe an insider, it's probably the threat that makes most sense because it's hard to imagine how an uprising of people marching on Pyongyang, which is so well defended, but maybe a marching of people toward the borders to try to escape. It's been a little mysterious to me why it is that there hasn't been such a march to the border to date. The number of people who left during the time of the terrible famine was less than one might have thought. So I don't underestimate the challenges here with this happening. And the to-do list, I mean, you hit on the most important one, and the frustration of China not wanting to talk about it. But at least Chinese scholars these days are willing to talk about it, and maybe that's where we can put more effort in our non-governmental organization think tank work. But I think one of the things first on the to-do list for the United States is get on the right side of history, make it clear that reunification, it has the support of the U.S. government, as we do with Germany.
Let's go.
Troy Singer with the Franklin Institute. Just sort of along the same theme, but to bring it back towards what's going on in Kaesong right now. One of the factors oftentimes in revolutions are rising expectations. And if I can shut Kaesong down, you now have 53,000 workers who most people believe support another roughly 200,000 people with their jobs. And while they're not paid much by Western standards, these are significant wages by North Korean standards. So how much, or how long can North Korea go? Because I do agree, I think they're going to restart before they take and sort of hit that rising expectation of their own population and create their own desegregation problems by these people now being cut off from what they did have before.
Thank you. Thank you for that good question. One reason I like to give a presentation before I publish something is that I can add the good ideas and improve the publication, and that's a good reason. And I think it's absolutely why North Korea, in addition to the exchange earnings loss, is going to restart Kaesong soon, but it'll be at a smaller level and without any expectation of an increase in income.
Stanley?
I'd like to ask you to focus on the short term, because starting from accepting your premise that regime changes so rapidly in the short term may be convenient, and listening to your proposed suggestions, it strikes me that they all make sense, but often said that any of them will work. We'll have to balance that against the short-term need. Do you think the current situation is qualitatively different from the short-term situation we faced recently, attacks, for example, 2000 over the time? Is there a risk that if these steps were taken even quietly, as you suggest, that North Korea, for whatever reason, there's power struggle, or there's misguided understanding of the situation of the current situation, that it could provoke very things we want to avoid? Something which might be harder to control. You want to possibly a lot more, but it could become one hell of a mess. So the question is it possible that we are left with a mind neglect or participation out there as the only thing to do in this dangerous period?
Thanks, Stanley. I share your analysis on this. I guess there are two ways in which the situation is qualitatively worse than recent past. And that is, we have there is a new leader at the helm who's untested. He wasn't there in 2010. I mean, he was there, but he wasn't the one making the decisions. And the nuclear weapons program has made advances. And the more advances it makes, presumably, the more risk willing will North Korea be on the assumption that they will have established a nuclear deterrent and then they can take lower level actions. So I think that's certainly reason to be cautious in any steps that are taken, and it may lead to the conclusion that a continuation of the current strategy is the best one for the short term. But I think we do have to try to put in some measures for the medium term looking ahead. without doing it in ways that are so in your face provocatively. Just when you started your question and say, is it qualitatively worse? I thought you were going to say, than in all the past crises and going back to Operation Paul Bunyan and so forth. And compared to that, I think we're not at that situation. We have to, you know as well, more than I do, that the situation was like back then. So there's some reason to not get too overly excited about North Korea's threats and to believe that it's a bark and not bite.
So fourth row back, light shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Oliver Delmer. I'm the US correspondent for the Austrian newspaper Presse. Sir, I'm not entirely convinced by the argument you make for reunification. Maybe I don't really understand it, so you could possibly elaborate on it. If reunification is the one thing that the regime of Pyongyang is most afraid of, because for them it would mean loss of power and everything. Why do you think that insisting on reunification is right now the best way forward to avoid any military hostilities or whatever? And if we draw that there's lots of talk about war now in Eastern Germany and so forth, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but an important step in the 70s to relax tensions between Eastern and Western Germany was the fact that the governments under Willy Brandt and so forth started to relax their relationships with Eastern Germany. At some point they even recognized them. And that opened up a certain space that made it possible for a certain civic engagement to start in the GDR. So why don't you think that it would be possibly better to, for example, negotiate a peace treaty with North Korea to end the Korean War finally, and then in the long run see whether that will change things within a country that will suddenly start having normal diplomatic relationships and so forth and so forth.
Nordpolitik.
This is such a polite audience. When somebody says, I'm not entirely convinced, it usually means I really disagree with you strongly. But you put it so politely. Okay, so the argument is this. You put pressure on the points of vulnerability to either get the regime to the point of being willing to negotiate away its nuclear weapons program, which I don't think is at all likely, but that's one possibility. And then, if it's not likely, as I said, to create the conditions for the real solution in the long term. Now, the argument that I mean, you know the German situation better than I do, so I won't argue the case there, although the information flow was, of course, very, very critical in the German situation, the flow of people and basis. Why isn't it possible to negotiate a peace treaty? I think that if the Republic of Korea asked for peace treaty negotiations with the North and asked Washington to join in, then Washington would go along with that. But the United States is not going to go along with North Korea's effort to exclude South Korea, 2/3 of the Korean Peninsula population, a country that, along with the North, lost most citizens in the Korean War. Not going to go along with that. Now, the other problem that makes a peace treaty negotiation harder now than it was up until 2006 is that peace treaties should not be negotiated in a way that recognizes and accepts North Korea's nuclear armed status. I think there's probably a way to address this through a staged negotiation at the end of which North Korea is not nuclear armed and there is a peace treaty. There's any number of analysts that come up with that solution. But it's not something, again, that we could say in response to provocations, okay, you win, we'll come to the table. But let's see what the South Koreans say about it. That would be my first answer.
I think the question all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Robert Hibbs. I'm with New Story Leadership. Thank you very much for coming today. I was wondering, what is the South Korean opinion on reunification, especially from an economic standpoint? Are there people in South Korea, especially among the general population, who fear a sort of unification that could damage South Korea's economy in the long term? Thank you.
Well, the polling in South Korea, reflects the implicit point you made in what you phrased as the question. There's not the support for unification has diminished over time and with age groups. But the policy of the government is fully in support of unification. The policy of the previous government was to create a fund to support unification. And I suspect that the current government will continue that. There's a realization of the tremendous economic costs of unification, which are only going to get worse. In the dossier that the IISS published on North Korea 2 years ago, we suggested that one solution to this cost would be to let China handle the problem. Let North Korea become even more of a vassal state of China. Let them bear the burden of shepherding North Korea into the modern age, and then maybe after 20 years, situation economically and politically would be more ripe for unification. That's another alternative, not one that the North Koreans want, of course. They despise the Chinese probably more than they despise the Americans, because the Chinese are right there lording over them. But yeah, I mean, when I promote unification, I do so not in the misguided belief that the South Korean population is going to cheer me on. They're not to a man and woman eager for that.
Same chair.
Same chair, Thank you, Mark. For a very interesting talk. Question about that's a definitional one, but it could be more than that. Are you advocating for regime change or unification? Because I guess unification is a variety, reunification is a variety of regime change, and you described one of the scenarios like a palace coup or a sort of military leadership takeover, during which one could imagine regime change without reunification, and whether or not that would accomplish the denuclearization objective. And on this Germany parallel, I think that perhaps another key difference is that the key facilitating factor for German reunification was the removal of support from the external patron, namely the Soviet Union in that case. And I wonder how a shift in Chinese policy could be incorporated into your vision of how this happens in the future.
Thanks, Sam. Well, okay, so to clarify, I advocate for reunification, which encompasses regime change, obviously. And a regime change that didn't lead to unification would not be my goal. But, I was asked the question, what might provoke a regime change? And so I mentioned the palace coup. But, in such a circumstance, then the likelihood of that palace coup solidifying is low, and evolving further in ways that could lead to the collapse of the regime, the chances are higher. So a palace coup might be an intermediary stage, not the goal that I would advocate, but it might be a possibility. The German and Soviet patron loss is a very key point, and as I say, I excluded China from my prepared remarks because people say that all the time, and I'm a little hopeful that the Chinese move toward North Korea will continue to evolve in the way that it is already evolving, with more and more sense in Beijing of despair at how things are going in North Korea. Although I think probably in the end the party leadership and the military leadership in Beijing will continue to draw the conclusion that they've got to stick with North Korea because the alternatives would be too unsettling to them. And I guess to go back to Hans Benedict's question about to-do list, that to-do list, in addition to the continued effort to try to talk to the Chinese, is if the United States could make at an official level a clear statement of intent that in a unified, in addition to supporting unification, there would be no intention to position U.S. forces beyond, U.S. permanent forces beyond the 38th parallel, and that the United States would, of course, want to assist in helping dealing with the refugee crisis. Now, whether China would believe the United States in any such statement of intent about stationing forces, they might look at how the Russians feel that the promises were not kept. But I still think that the promise should be made in the case of China.
Second row.
Thanks, Mark, for the great presentation.
Go to identify yourself.
I'm sorry? Oh, Al O'Neill, sorry. More of a comment than a question. When you talk about what would happen as the North begins to disintegrate, fall apart, it seems to me that rather than suggesting that the U.S. would have the lead role, I think there would be a lot of reasons, including just reality on the ground, why the ROK would have a lead role and we would have a supporting role. And one of them, I think, would be linked to China. Presumably, the Chinese would be less upset with a leading ROK role, both civil and military, in the northern half of the peninsula than they would with a leading U.S. role.
Thanks, Al. That's another point that I think I'll adjust my presentation. By the way, one reason people don't always identify themselves is because we've known each other for 30 years, but he forgets that you don't know him. Al O'Neill from the State Department.
Sir, for that.
I'm Tom Carver from Carnegie Endowment. And I just wanted to echo your comments about a subtle mood shift in Beijing. And we're finding this at the Carnegie Center in Beijing. We recently had a very prominent Asian professor write to our website saying that China should cut its ties with North Korea. And as you say, a couple of others are beginning to feel the same way, that the effort is not worth it. But it suggests to me that there is a fruitful opportunity here for us to push on that door and try to encourage and reassure the Chinese that there might be a way that in, say, 20 years, a reunified Korea would be absolutely in their economic interest in a massive market, overland route to the sea, and so forth. So that whilst they may have military hesitations about the US, if we can provide those reassurances, there may be a very clear economic benefits that we could help to lay out. And I wonder whether you feel that there's not more that can be done.
That's one of those comments that people make a very wise comment and then they put a question mark. Do you agree with me? And I definitely agree with that. Thank you for that suggestion.
Sir.
I'm Paul Richter with the LA Times. If you can comment on the immediate situation we're in right now, do you think that the North Koreans are likely to fire off a few short, medium-range missiles this weekend, declare victory, and then will return to the status quo?
That's the optimistic prediction of.
That's the optimistic version?
That's the optimistic version of what might ensue in the next week. North Korea does see an intent on launching Musudan for the first time. I think they see that as a necessary means of putting hardware where their mouth is. Many of us don't really believe that North Korea has an operational medium-range ballistic missile. And maybe we said so too loudly, and they are going to show us doubters what they have. But surely the military in North Korea have their own reasons to want to have some confidence that what they have really works. Now, one launch wouldn't give any American military commander confidence that the thing would work. They'd want to test it a dozen times under different conditions. North Koreans have a very low tempo of such tests, partly because one of their main purposes is that these missiles are a political deterrent, and if they test it once and it works, they instill fear in the adversaries, and that's maybe good enough for their purposes. But why I say it's an optimistic scenario that after firing it off, they'll say, okay, declare victory, and then go back to, or go to a pursuit of economic reforms, is that there's a tit for tat, reciprocal situation here, that when Musudan is fired, there will be a response to it, and there should be. There'll be another Security Council resolution. The United States, Japan, and South Korea will take additional steps. And then North Korea may feel compelled to do something in response to that. Let's hope that what they do is, again, in the declaratory nature of things and not a kinetic response, but one can't rule out a kinetic response, particularly after the current large-scale military exercise has finished. So I think we're going to be in a situation of tension for the next months, and I'm not saying that.
Fifth row, yes, sir.
Thank you. Dean Rust, former State Department colleague of Mark's. Mark, talking about reunification, I'm going to take a devil's advocate position for a minute. You seem to be accepting essentially that North Korea has nuclear weapons and will integrate them in any way that they're capable of doing over the next few years into their military structure, whatever it is. Can we really abandon, are you suggesting that we abandon the denuclearization goal as a long-term goal on the peninsula? And if we still want to do that, doesn't that still mean that we have to almost necessarily be open to engagement on the nuclear issue, even if it means we're never going to get this regime to completely denuclearize? The other observation is, do you think we've done what we need to do to deter North Korea from either brandishing its nuclear weapons or using its nuclear weapons or giving them to terrorists or giving them to terrorists? Do you think the North Koreans understand the consequences of that? Will it be effectively deterred?
Dean, you put your finger on the conundrum here. I don't think the questions you posed are really dependent on the proposition that you led with about whether or not we accept that North Korea has nuclear weapons and will integrate them. I think we have to operate on the assumption that they probably do and proceed from there. I mean, we might hope that they can't, but whether they do or not, we have to operate that way. And no, we can't abandon denuclearization as a goal, not just a declaratory goal, but we continue to push for it, but realizing that that probably isn't going to happen as long as there's a DPRK. At least in government, you can't say that, but I can say it outside government. I'll change if I get back to me. And of course, we should be open to negotiation, but just and there might be some things we're going to get from it, but what North Korea will ask in return maybe too much for what we would get for it. We could try. I just don't think we should have. We should think that we're going to get what they never were willing to give before. Especially when the more countries develop, the less likely you are to get rolled back to zero. I think have we done enough to deter? I think we have, but you used 3 verbs to deter them from brandishing, from using, and from transferring. Now, we're not going to deter them from brandishing. That's what they do. But that doesn't matter. The use, absolutely. Use is not in the cards unless it's under dire circumstances of of war breaking out, and then the North thinking that that's the last thing between them and their extinction. The transfer is one that probably deterrence is not. Deterrence might not be the most effective tool to prevent transfers, because they might think that they can do it in ways that are not detectable. And so other means of preventing transfer, and here's Security Council resolutions that get at all the various routes of transfer and try to dry up the Chinese intermediaries and so forth, probably are more effectively. I remember when George W. Bush in 2006 made a statement about North Korean transfer of nuclear weapons, technology, even technology, and he's referring, I guess, to designs, would be a red line. That hasn't been, well, Syria started in 2001, so he probably had Syria on his mind when he said that. And whether the Syria transfer continued after he said that, it was well underway by then. Whether the Myanmar supposed transfers happened after 2005. Yeah, there's some questions one can raise about whether or not whether that has been deterred. But I think other means of stopping it hopefully have been effective.
Mark, we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to ask it. It's a point of genuine curiosity. Apart from the United States declaring that it's an objective of national policy to have reunification on the peninsula, what in particular changes in U.S. policy and programs vis-a-vis the North? I mean, I ask this because I'm a little shaky on what we actually do right now, but the steps that you outlined struck me as doing more of what we already do in pursuit of this currently unarticulated objective. And secondly, you just said something that I thought was somewhat provocative, that the use of nuclear weapons by the North was really not in the cards, because they were effectively deterred. So if that's the case, why are we even having this discussion? I guess two questions.
Yeah, those are two questions, aren't they? Yeah, when I don't have major areas of fault with the current posture. When I talked about strategic patience, I didn't say we should shift away from it. I noted that some have advocated a shift away from it, and I lent some sympathy to that, but I'm a little cautious about coming out and arguing for major changes. So I'll stick with the declaratory one on unification. And the statement about not posting U.S. forces north of the 38th parallel. I'm not sorry, U.S. bases north of the 38th parallel. Why? Yeah, I say with great confidence that North Korea wouldn't use nuclear weapons, but I might be wrong. And I think the circumstances of use are not out of totally impossible. You could really imagine a situation that starts with a one-off pinprick attack on a Western Sea island to which South Korea responds forcefully. North Korea retaliates. Somebody doesn't get the order right, and you start having some major civilian casualties in South Korea, and another response. And pretty soon you've got a war. That's a possibility. It's not a likelihood, but it's a real possibility. And if you get in a war situation, then the use of nuclear weapons becomes very possible, because North Korea is going to lose that war. And if the using of that war causes North Korea to think that they're also going to lose their regime, because forces go beyond 30, then nuclear use is very possible. So that's why we're having this discussion. There's a real danger.
Isn't there, on Steve's question, we still have this short-term problem that they keep on testing, sooner or later, it's all going to work. So isn't that actually the most immediate medium-term reason where at some suitable interval, we got to talk to these guys, or we know they're going to end up with stuff.
I think that's a great question for a post Discussion. So I'd like to thank Mark for his bravura performance.
Yeah,
here today.
Thank you, sir.